again. Okay, we're starting. You ready, Simpiwe? We're starting.
Okay.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 15th Annual Competition Law and Economics and Policy Conference, which is proudly and jointly hosted by the Competition Commission of South Africa, and
as well as the Competition Tribunal.
For the second year running, the conference is being hosted virtually and is perhaps the most important conference to date, given the times that we are living in. In this year's theme, the conference is themed Economic Recovery and Reconstruction, the Role of Competition Policy. This conference enjoins legal practitioners, economists, politicians, academics, industry role players, and civic society in a meeting of the minds to discuss and reflect on competition regulation, state of the economy, policy proposals aimed at shaping an inclusive, deconstructed economy. My name is Simpiwe Gumede. I'm your host, your co-MC, and I'm ably assisted by...
My name is Mpumi Chabalala, and I will also be your co-MC for today. And you'll be exposed to either both of us or one of us throughout the course of proceedings. As Simpiwe was intimating, it's in addressing economic recovery and reconstruction that speakers from multidisciplinary institutions will tackle, among other topics, the urgent need to build capable state institutions that are critical in the achievement of a growing and inclusive economy in South Africa. The conference is also expected to take stock of the challenges, progress, and achievements over the last few years in South Africa, while looking at the experiences as well of the United States and Mexico.
Without any further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the Commissioner of the Competition Commission, who will officially open the conference and give us his welcoming remarks. Commissioner Bonagele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simpiwe, and our co-host today, Bumi, for the exciting welcome and really bringing much needed energy into what is sometimes quite a boring virtual platforms. Invited guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to say all protocol observed. I would like to welcome all of you to our 5th Annual Competition Law, Economics and Policy Conference. I especially welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Somadoda Figeni Ikesbelku, whom I will introduce more fully when he is being called upon to speak. And another special word of welcome to all our distinguished panelists and speakers, both local and international. Allow me to especially mention Francis Karaoke, who is the head of the Kenyan Competition Authority. And I also welcome those who will be presenting papers today. Thank you all for honoring us with your presence and agreeing to speak at our conference. We are looking forward to hearing all of you speak. I should from the onset indicate that our conference coincides with quite an exciting local government election campaign in South Africa. And we would be most fortunate if any of the politicians in our program makes it. But we are in touch with their offices, and we will shift around our program where possible to accommodate them. So Minister Patel will not be present for the opening session of our conference, and we hope that we can receive his address in the next coming days of the conference. He's quite keen himself to come and address the conference. So we'll keep working with his office to facilitate that. And I should also mention that the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition is well represented otherwise at the conference. Colleagues, regrettably, as we start our conference, we are in mourning. 3 days ago, we learned of the untimely passing of our dear colleague, Tsepo Sikaiwa, an analyst at our market conduct division, a young man who joined as an intern in 2016. He worked in some of the groundbreaking projects at the Commission, including the Public Transport Market Inquiry. He left a lasting legacy and one we pledge as his colleagues to uphold. It is fitting that we dedicate this conference to his memory. We send our deepest condolences to the family, friends, acquaintances of our departed colleague. As many of you are also aware, on the 7th of September 2021, we also lost our beloved acting judge president of the Competition Appeal Court, Justice Bekisisa Jerome Nguni. His outstanding characteristic was his kind and welcoming spirit with his colleagues in the legal fraternity, often remarking about it. Justice Nguni made a valuable contribution to the judiciary, writing a number of competition law judgments, amongst others, and sitting in many important cases. He was always prepared. His specialization in commercial law and competition law in particular made us, many Black practitioners of this craft, look up to him as an example of excellence. At the time of his passing, Justice Nguni was the sole candidate nominated for the position of Judge President of the Competition Appeal Court, a clear indication that he was destined for judicial leadership. I want to take this opportunity to once more pass our condolences to his family, colleagues, friends, and appreciate his contribution to the development of competition law jurisprudence in our country. Farewell, our JP. Now, I request that we observe a moment of silence in remembrance of our dear colleagues. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, when we did the conference virtually last year, little did we know that we would have another virtual conference again. But you all know how unpredictable things are with COVID-19. With global developments in access to vaccines and what scientists are telling us, we are hopeful that the next will once again have a conference where we would be able to see you and welcome you in our country and at a conference venue. I wish to pause here in remembrance of so many friends, family, colleagues, and acquaintances we lost, often with little opportunity to mourn. We also pay homage to caregivers as well as survivors of the pandemic who have seen the devastation, but also the courageous response from all who were affected and impacted. We've seen this with our staff too. We as a generation and as a people truly are in this together. We also know the economic devastation occasioned, or in our case, worsened by COVID-19. It is for this reason that we have chosen the theme of the conference, Economic Recovery and Reconstruction, the Role of Competition Policy. It is our firm belief that if competition policy does not contribute to recovery and growth, then it is good for nothing. We have said this before, that the South African competition law must respond to both economic and development challenges of the country. We live in a middle-income country, and there are two things awaiting us. Either we slide deeper into an economic basket case with worsening unemployment, poverty, and inequality, or join the rapidly industrializing and increasingly prosperous emerging economies. Much of what happens to us depends on the decisions we make and implement today. As things stand, I'm afraid we are getting poorer, and each day we are drifting away from shared prosperity. Whilst no competition policy can solve all the country's problems, we are determined to contribute by asking the right questions and playing our part in answering those questions that are within our authority. As the Competition Commission, we have always been conscious of our context. We are interested in the transformational impact of our decisions at both micro and macro level. I will return on how we have done this year in pursuit of this endeavor. But let me first give you a snippet of the conference. So, as you know, it is virtual, and although we are all getting accustomed to this platform, let us bear with one another. Technical glitches are always a possibility that can be expected in platforms of this nature. When I think of the technical team that put together this conference, I'm reminded of the old advert for the Comrades Marathon, which used to show a runner crossing mountains just to get to the starting line of the Comrades Marathon. I know that the technical team has worked tirelessly for months just to get us to begin the marathon today. The next 3 days will be a marathon for them, and I wish them the best of luck. It's easy when you get to the 15th version of a conference, as we have done, to take the conversations and discussions that happen here for granted. But the annual competition conference has never been a talk shop without concrete outcomes. This conference has developed a reputation for addressing current pertinent issues, regardless of their implications for the commission or tribunal. We have always presented robust debates on competition cases that have gone in our favor and those that we have lost in courts. We have had policy discussions on matters that challenge us and on issues that we agree on. We have always made it a point to include supportive and dissenting voices on our panels. This year, we continue this tradition of addressing even the most difficult topics ahead and head on. And we look forward to the debates and outcomes that are likely to emerge from each session and each lecture. We will start off with a panel that will uncover the various lessons we have as regulators learned from the pandemic and how we could deal with similar occurrences in the future. The next plenary session will consider all the factors necessary to build a capable state and state institutions. This is in recognition of the centrality of state capacity to the realization of the aspirations of the nation. This is particularly important for economic aspirations. For this panel, we will draw on the experience of both local and international practitioners of statecraft, including those who headed agencies in comparative jurisdictions. Plenary 3 aims to be a pragmatic session that goes beyond academic and regulatory insights. We will be exploring competition enforcement in sectors that are crucial for economic recovery. We welcome again our dear friends from the academia and regulatory world on this panel. A very exciting panel is set to take place on Friday in the session that will zone in on the pharmaceutical industry and access to vaccines and other pharmaceutical products in the context of COVID-19. No doubt, quite an interesting topic for all of us. We will also have a closing panel that will cover public interest issues in economic recovery and transformation. Whilst public interest has always been a topical issue generating much debate, this year, the Burger King transaction brought transformation to the fore as an issue for focused discussion within the broader public interest debate. This is only fitting in the development of our jurisdiction because it shows that public interest is now firmly entrenched as a concept within this field. We have 4 academic sessions this year, and they will take place on day 1 and day 2. These sessions promise to be great platforms for emergence of new ideas and even new personalities on the competition scene. I encourage you all to join these sessions, especially those practicing competition law inside and outside the Commission. This year, we've also included several keynote speeches and solo lectures addressing a range of topics. We will have at least one on each day of the conference, and we hope this will stimulate interest, especially in a virtual environment. Besides all that I have outlined, we are honored to host several events this year, including the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding with our counterparts from Barbados, and another one with the Information Regulator of South Africa. I'm also delighted to announce the launch of our research grant program aimed at attracting research, academic research on competition policy and cases. With an annual research grant of up to 150,000 per research project, we hope that this investment will widen the pool of researchers and publications in this important policy area. Our Chief Economist, James Hodge, will elaborate on this after this address. We will also be launching a very important African Competition Forum Aviation Report alongside our colleagues from several African competition agencies. We are particularly interested in this study as it is essential. Aviation is essential for connectivity in our continent. And if there is any hope of economic integration, it is important that we look at these industries that are essential for connectivity. So our hosts, Mpumi and Simpiwe, will share more on each one of these events as they approach, and they will also be announcing any changes to the program as we go along. As I indicated, we do have politicians in the main crisscrossing the country in campaigns, and so we might have to accommodate them as and when they become available. Returning to our work this year, there are several highlights spanning mergers and acquisitions, enforcement, advocacy, as well as research. For reasons of time and space, I will touch on only a few, and some of these are covered in any event in our annual report, should you wish to get more detail. I'll start firstly with affirmation of constitutionalism. We have for some time now been concerned about the development of substantive competition law in parallel with the Constitution. Whilst the case for constitutional alignment of procedural aspects is clear-cut, it was less clear in respect of substantial aspects of competition law. The Commission sought to test this relationship between competition law and constitutional law in the case involving the Competition Commission of South Africa versus Media 24, in a matter involving the appropriate test to predation or predatory pricing. However, on that occasion, the Constitutional Court was deeply divided. But just last week, on Friday, the 15th October 2021, the Constitutional Court delivered an important judgment in the case involving the Competition Commission of South Africa and Mediclinic South Africa. The judgment was penned by Mogoeng CJ, as he then was, which firstly clarifies the intersection between competition law and constitutional law. The Constitutional Court strongly reasserted the mandatory application to the Competition Act of the interpretative injunction in Section 39(2) of the Constitution, which enjoins every court or tribunal, when interpreting any legislation, to promote the spirit, purpose, and objects of the Bill of Rights. In this regard, the Constitutional Court said at paragraph 9, and I quote, "The invocation of Section 39(2) of the Constitution in interpreting legislation that implicates a right in the Bill of Rights ought not be viewed as an optional extra. It should rather be seen as a constitutional injunction. When any of the parties have, whether any of the parties have specifically contended for the interpretation of legislation with express reference to or through the prism of Section 39(2), not really matter. It is, broadly speaking, a constitutional obligation that rests on the shoulders of any court interpreting legislation or developing common law or customary law to promote the spirit, purport, and objects of the Bill of Rights. And secondly, re-echoes the principle of deference to the expertise of the tribunal, as had been articulated in the Competition Appeal Court itself in several decisions, including Immers as well as Schoeman, and that sets the threshold for appellate interference with the tribunal's findings. Thirdly, is sensitive to the impact of inequality on consumer welfare in measures. In this regard, the Constitutional Court said, maintaining or increasing the scope for choice of essential and much needed service, with particular regard to the plight of the financially and under-resourced and the vulnerable, should always be at the back of decision makers when dealing with measures. The intersection between constitutional law and competition law will shape the development of competition law in the post-Mediclinic world. I now want to address the issue of efficient management of litigation. Our institutions are clogged with a backlog of both investigations and prosecutions flowing from the lockdowns as well as increased volumes of cases emanating from the pandemic period. Compounding the situation are parties that game the system to prevent the cases from being held on the merit. In recent years, there have been a proliferation of exception applications in the tribunal which has had an effect of delaying prosecutions from being heard on the merits. We are of the firm view that exceptions should not be used to ventilate issues that ought to be raised in answering affidavits and issues that should be heard at trial. In the Competition Commission versus Shoprite Checkers, the Competition Tribunal held at an exception stage expressly rejected the possibility of the prosecution of a single economic entity under the abuse provisions as not forming part of our law. However, the Competition Appeal Court has reversed this finding on the basis that it was premature for the tribunal to make a legally complex finding at exception stage, and that such a finding would only be made after a trial, a full trial or hearing. In that case, the Commission bemoans the parties' tendency to want to run a trial by exceptions. We are also delighted that, again, the same parties this time around litigated before the Constitutional Court and were challenging the citing of a parent company, that is CompuTicket and Shoprite. We are delighted that the Constitutional Court has once more ruled that these objections are premature and that the Commission could go ahead and cite all the parties it wishes to cite and run the case, and any disputes in this regard could be determined and adjudicated later. Just briefly on COVID-19, as you all know that COVID-19 was a dominant feature that defined much of our operations in this past year. It brought upheaval and very difficult strategic choices. But I'm immensely proud that the Competition Commission and the Competition Tribunal weathered the storm. We've had to disrupt our systems and how we work in order to be able to respond to an unprecedented situation that nothing could have prepared us for. The pandemic called for a decisive response, and we are immensely proud of the resilience of our institutions, as well as their maturity and adaptiveness. We have a panel that is going to tackle COVID-19 experience, so I will not say much about this, except to mention that as a result of the prevalence of price gouging, the Commission has initiated a food price monitoring research in order to understand retail level inflation and the need for enforcement action. We in the research covered products such as fresh produce, which displayed some market volatility and differentials across markets nationally, movements in grains and fresh produce prices in the wholesale and commodity trading markets. Insights from these have been invaluable, and this work must continue beyond the pandemic. I want now to touch on a few guidelines we have done. We have published guidelines for competition in the automotive aftermarkets following several years of stakeholder complaints and engagements for more proactive, pro-competitive aftermarkets for the auto sector. The aim of the guideline is to open up the aftermarket for service and maintenance of motor vehicles, as well as the supply of parts, paving a way for inclusion and competition, particularly for SMMEs and historically disadvantaged individuals. Following the 2019 amendments to the Competition Act aimed at enhancing buyer power and price discrimination enforcement, to support entry of SMMEs and HDIs in the economy, the Commission published the guidelines for buyer power and price discrimination as a step in implementing the amendments. I must pause at this juncture to acknowledge that the Commission has won an award in the soft law article in the subcategory Unilateral Conduct in 2021 Antitrust Writing Awards by Concurrencies for our buyer power enforcement guidelines. I congratulate our colleagues for this recognition by our peers, as well as an impressive panel of experts. On market inquiries, this past year saw successful completion of the public passenger transport market inquiry, focusing on competition issues in the sector. There are many competition issues that emerge from this inquiry, including the structural relationship between the state-owned PRASA and Autoparks, which operates various state-owned bus companies, and its exclusionary impact on the market, inequitable allocation of subsidies to different modes of transport, as well as regulatory barriers in e-hailing and metered taxis. Several recommendations have been made in this regard to bring about a more integrated yet competitive transport sector. We are therefore engaging with stakeholders, including government, to ensure that these recommendations are implemented. Following the successful completion of the grocery retail market inquiry, we have been able to achieve great progress during the year, and we have concluded settlement consent agreement with Shoprite Checkers and Pick n Pay, which, as many of you who follow our work would have seen, that the two committed to eliminate the exclusivity contracts in shopping malls against small and independent retailers. And we hope that this will lower barriers to entry to these groups, and we should be able to see not only full service supermarket chains run by independents, but also specialty stores such as greengrocers, butcheries, and so on in shopping malls. In a similar vein, we were able to achieve progress following the recommendations made by the mobile data market inquiry, where we had the major mobile firms agreeing through settlement agreements to reduce their costs for prepaid data. The inquiry had found that the prices were excessive and anti-poor, and therefore the settlement agreement sought to reduce these prices, but also to make a number of sites to be accessible to consumers, and so for some discounting for poorer consumers. This proved to be particularly important during the 19 lockdowns, as many consumers switch and citizens switch to online services to access various services. It is also important, perhaps, that we also mention that we are currently conducting a market inquiry into online intermediate platform markets. Our real first market inquiry into digital markets. And I'm sure that this is going to be a subject of many debates to come, including in this conference. On measures, the concentration and monopolization of our economy remains a major concern, and we have undertaken a major study in this regard that confirm our earlier studies. We will release the study before the end of the year. This calls for robustness in assessing measures to prevent a further concentration in markets. This year, we challenged the cash build measure, which would have reduced the number of building supplier national groups from 3 to 2, and lead to monopolization in some rural towns. The parties subsequently abandoned the transaction. Mergers also have a potential to have adverse effects on public interest. More recently, as I have indicated, we saw a considerable debate of these matters when we were dealing with the Burger King transaction. More on this is to come during our panel discussion. The Commission continues to play its role in international organizations. Our position has recently been confirmed as the Vice Chair of the International Competition Network, of which South Africa is a founder member alongside 14 member countries. I also wish to congratulate our sister agency, the Kenyan Competition Authority, which has also joined the steering committee of the ICN, the second country in the African continent to join this rank. The membership of the ICNs now stand at 100, and the ICN will be celebrating its 20th anniversary on Monday. We look forward to discuss and shape the future of the ICN. We also continue our participation and leadership in the African Competition Forum, a platform which is crucial for our continent. And we continue to also play a leading role in BRICS, which will have its conference also next month, hosted by China. It is important that South Africa do all of this work. We live in a global village and markets know no boundaries. There are two major issues in the global competition agenda, namely the digital markets driven by platforms to dominate markets using personal data, amongst other things, as well as sustainability, which includes environmental protection, but for us also includes economic development. I therefore welcome all of you and look forward to the debates in the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bonagele. And as intimated during his speech, we are now handing over to Mr. James Hodge, who will be doing something absolutely exciting for us. As you are aware, at this year's competition conference, we will be launching this groundbreaking research grant program. James will tell us more in a moment. Over to you, Mr. Hodge.
Thank you, Mpumi, and I think you preempted it by highlighting the multidisciplinary nature of the participants in this conference and some of the sessions. So the Competition Commission is pleased to announce the launch of a multidisciplinary research grant program aimed at promoting multidisciplinary research at South African tertiary institutions and research institutions that can inform and enhance competition law enforcement in the country. I think, as we all know, competition law enforcement in South Africa uniquely has a broader mandate than simply maintaining and promoting competition to the benefit of consumers alone. The mandate has always incorporated the broader public interest of promoting a more inclusive economy, especially for SMEs and historically disadvantaged persons, but also the broader mandate of economic development, which has been highlighted, I think, increasingly in the economic recovery mandate that is the theme for this particular conference. I think whilst these may have been niche or fringe considerations globally, that has changed in the last few years and have become far more mainstream. But the pandemic and the environmental crisis has also, I think, highlighted a broader challenge to competition law more broadly, including the ability to address inequality in society and other societal ills. And this conference highlights some of those themes. But for instance, challenges around the environment and an inclusion of gender issues within competition law. We've seen recently challenges and debates in public around the amendments and how the implementation of these amendments should be addressed. But also, as the Commissioner highlighted, last week's Constitutional Court ruling has now firmly brought the Constitution interpretation into fundamental parts of the Act and not relegated to public interest components alone. Of course, the issue of digital markets looms large, with many challenges within that as well. So the broad mandate and these new challenges to competition law enforcement, I think, demands not just a stronger research community in South Africa to debate, challenge, and inform appropriate enforcement, but it also does demand a far more multidisciplinary approach, which benefits from technical expertise and insights from fields other than competition economics and law. So in launching this multidisciplinary research grant program, the Commission hopes to stimulate multidisciplinary research on these substantive issues, but also to develop a new generation of academics that will continue to support research in this field in the future. And for this reason, the grant program will give special consideration to research teams that are multidisciplinary and which will include junior and early career researchers. So the grant is aimed at doctoral students, postdoctoral researchers, academics based in South African tertiary institutions, and experienced researchers in research institutions. The grant, as the Commissioner indicated, will range from 50,000 to 150,000 and will be available for successful proposals subject to an overall budget limit. And the Commission will also support the researchers through access to our merger database, investigative teams, and individuals as well. The adjudication process for the research grant will make use of an academic reference group in order to assist with the assessment of the technical merit of the proposals, the technical capabilities of the research teams, and also capacity building. The other character or factor that will be assessed will also be the enforcement relevance of the research, and these factors will go into determining the size of the research grant that will be awarded. The academic research reference group will include senior academics as well as former members of the Tribunal Appeal Court and the Commission. The process has been launched today, and proposals are welcome up until the end of January. Following the review of proposals and research, we hope that at next year's conference, we will be allowing successful presenters of their research papers to come and inform the broader community as well. So thank you very much, Mpumi, and I hope this does make a difference to the research in this country to face the challenges that we do face in terms of just the economy, inclusion, and the competition law enforcement more broadly.
Thank you very much, Mr. James Hodge, for that. I think it's a really, really exciting program. And I think competition law and policy is going to grow in leaps and bounds as the future progresses. It's a fantastic initiative. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand over back to the Commissioner, Mr. Wanagale, who will introduce our guest speaker for this morning. Mr. Wanagale.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to take a stage once more, hopefully not for too long, to warmly introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Somadoda Figeni. He really needs no introduction. He is a very well-known public speaker in South Africa, covering his commentary covering politics in the main. That's how we see him, but also heritage issues, as well as economic and governance issues. Dr. Figeni holds a PhD from United States University of Michigan, and has also held management positions, including being the CEO of the National Heritage Council. He is currently the commissioner of the Public Service Commission, having been recently appointed to this position. I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate you for this Kasile. And I really hope that this position, this could be just that position that is able to help us as South Africa as we grapple with the establishment of a meritocracy civil service, which in my respectful view is the only way out of our current wobbles. I really do think that the solution to our country's problems lies more at a technocratic and civil service level, more so than political level. But with those few words, allow me, without wasting much time, to welcome our guest speaker and thank him for agreeing at a relatively short notice to come and give us this talk. Dr. Fike.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Bonagele, and your fellow commissioners, as well as executive leadership of your entity. Let me also greet the fellow panelists, the fellow presenters, the invited guests from here and abroad, including the diaspora that you are going to be signing an MOU with. Congratulations for that. Let me also congratulate your organization, the Competition Commission, precisely because in a society that is ranked in some of the literature as the most unequal in the world, you have to be facing the giant companies, the giant players with only a slingshot. And you have turned around the notion of how would you face such giant Goliaths because of your conviction, because they are so big. But you turn around to say, how can I miss this target, which is so big and obvious? So for that, we really congratulate you for the work that you've done. In essence, what I want to speak to is the current challenges and the importance of leadership and rebuilding the state capacity in the reconstruction and recovery phase of South Africa, especially post-COVID-19 pandemic. I felt it very important for me to start with this stanza from Charles Dickens, that classic, A Tale of Two Cities, which says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In a short space of 27 years, we've moved from that period of excitement where we were moving from falling into a racial civil war, as many had predicted in the 80s, into being a model in the world, from a pariah state to being a model in the world. But within that space of time, in the last 10 or more years, we've seen a decline where again we are being cited as just being one of the ordinary post-colonial states in Africa afflicted by neo-colonial crisis and maladies which are expected. And I want to say also, we are in a time between times and a place between places. We are not where we were in 1994, but we are certainly not where we intended to be. As a nation, we seem to have taken a detour. But despite all that, despite the deepening crisis globally and in the country, where you have now COVID-19, which has compounded the situation, some call it a black swan event that we could not see coming. Some call it a gray rhino event, which was always there, always imminent, but we simply didn't pay much attention to it. But despite all that, as I was reading some of the literature, it became very clear that most of the countries that have pressed a reset button and turned around are countries that never let a good crisis go to waste, as Churchill should be paraphrased. A crisis in any society focuses the minds of different stakeholders. It creates a sense of existential crisis or existential anxiety. And it is out of that crisis that we begin to reimagine a future that we never thought was possible. And it is out of that crisis that certain fault lines are exposed, because that is exactly what COVID-19 has done. It simply amplified some of our weaknesses, which we knew were there, but to the extent that it has magnified them now, it is difficult for us to ignore them. Of course, it is compounding the problems that we already had, but it has now exposed those. But not only that, some social scientists are beginning to say COVID-19 and the convergence of all other trends, mega trends driving changes in the world, whether it's the climate change or the geopolitical shifts, are beginning to define a new epoch in human history. What will that new epoch be? And how will we position ourselves within that? What attributes, what capacity do we need to participate meaningfully in that new epoch? Because it is very key that as we see the crisis we have, we do not begin to try and say, how do we solve the problems of the past, and forget that there are new emerging patterns, even in terms of competition, even in terms of monopolies. Within this current space, as you see some industries declining, some collapsing, you are beginning to see some new role players, some trying to occupy that space. There is no better industry than the airline industry that has seen a dramatic decline and disruption. And out of that, whatever you might have seen as a competition or monopolies or structures within that in the last 2 years has radically changed now, which means a rethink. So that is my starting point in all this. Perhaps let me start with truism, which says, throughout human history, conflicts, contestations have always emanated from domination and exclusion. Whether this is slavery, colonialism, apartheid, imperialism, or current monopolies within industries in the countries and across the world. The notion of domination and exclusion has always been the source of conflict. Whether you talk in the church history or in the religious conflicts or political conflicts or social conflicts or conflicts over economy, it's always been domination and exclusion. So we must always bear in mind that it is not just for the fairness sake that we say you must have an inclusive economy, that you must have some degree of social justice, but it is the fact that throughout human history, conflict has been generated when you see that certain players dominate. Sometimes they influence the rules and they monopolize to the exclusion of the others. South Africa has been ranked by some scholars as being one of the most unequal societies in the world, with Black youth and women, particularly West, victims of this exclusion. And COVID-19, as I have indicated, has simply exposed these weaknesses in many ways. And not only exposed, it has worsened the situation, whether it's our fiscal situation where we will be saying, how do we do more with less? How do we become more efficient? How do we become more creative in having higher impact? That's where partnerships become very important at times, because you may knock at Treasury and find that they may not have the money and wherewithal to give injection to some of the most important projects. Sequencing and prioritizing becomes very important so that you have that catalytic impact in some of these programs. The problems that we face as a country before we even talk about how to build the state capacity are multifold, and they've converged in many ways. And one must have this historical context even as we deal with the current and emerging patterns. The first one is a historical legacy, which is structural in its nature. The apartheid and colonial geography, which was there before 1994, which is pretty much here today, whether it's spatial or it is access to credit or it is the economic outlook of our country. You have this concentration of wealth, of dominance within certain role players. And some of those, it's a historical legacy. Then you do have the current policies and policy choices and even failures of leadership, as well as the patronage network. We've become a patrimonial state that thrives very often on networks, that thrives on corruption. Now, once you have a patrimonial system, the dominant players, especially in the corporate sector, thrive in that space because they can bribe leaders, they can bribe political leaders, they can bribe political systems under the code of lobbying. And that is why it was very important to see the dynamics of how during the lockdown, alcohol and cigarettes, and tobacco became the most dominant topics, even more than health itself at times, because these are regulated industries. These are industries which were impacted on, and you could begin to see their lobbying power. You could begin to see their lobbying muscle and how the leadership responded to some of those. And it is that concentration of power in fewer hands, in fewer corporates, that translates into undue influence into the political spaces, whether you call it party funding or individual funding. Then that translates into frustrating some of the programs which could be dealing with anti-competitive behavior. So we must begin to understand that ecosystem of how one feeds into the other, and also begin to watch the space of the party funding now that there is a demand and the legislation to expose anything above 100,000 how will this mutate into other forms of influence, or how will it impact on the political corporate interface? Then what happened because of the aforementioned patronage networks as they were evolving more dramatically in the last decade? When patronage networks emerge, they must, by nature, as you see in comparative examples across the world, collapse institutions, because they operate by overriding whatever institutional arrangement is there. And they depend on personalities. And those personalities which are brought to bear in a patronage system, loyalty always works better than competence. That is why you find some people who have been fielded into positions because of the patronage networks, which they themselves, they can't believe that they were appointed to such positions. So they spend their term of office trying to recover from the shock of being appointed. Once you are in that particular space of vulnerability, then you are open to do the bidding for whoever says, I put you there, because you have no professional pride, you have no professional standing, and the ethics are the lowest consideration in your list of things, because you do not even believe why you were put in the place. So you spend the rest of your term trying to recover from the shock of being appointed. And the first thing, you become hostile and antagonistic to those who are professionals in the space, who will remind you how things work, because you are trying to establish your power. And it is for that reason that even in the corruption investigations, even in the commissions of inquiry, most of the time you see the patronage networks, right from recruitment, deployment, call it anything, up to the operations, which often create a parallel reality to the existing institutional arrangement. So the reconstruction itself has to deal with that reality of institutions that were collapsed because patronage system was on the rise. And that patronage system has to be dismantled. It led to leadership and institutional weaknesses, because those with professional pride, those who could stand their ground, those who tried to stand by their principles and ethics, were pushed to the side, because the patrimonial system doesn't work well when you do have such people. It is not for the absence of capable people, but it's just that they've been marginalized in the main. Yes, there might be shortages here and there, but also the public consciousness, because we should always mention that you need leadership, capable, visionary, ethical leadership, but also you need capable institutions, particularly those of state. But you also need a conscious citizenry that takes interest in the civic affairs of the state, so that they can be watchdogs themselves. So these weaknesses have also meant that what were the promises of a very progressive constitution could not be translated into legislations or policies, or where it had been translated, these had not been properly implemented. I won't go through the convergence of multiple crises like your COVID-19, as I've mentioned, but I dare mention that the socio-economic crisis that is afflicting mainly your youth, Black youth in particular, and women. And within this short space of time since last year, we are told by researchers that food insecurity have moved from 7% to almost 20% at household levels, which means people who simply cannot get food to eat. That is why then the Competition Commission becomes very important, as you saw in some instances at a certain point of a crisis, existential crisis in the country. The prices of ginger, the prices of garlic, and other essential goods which were seen to be immune boosters went up. In some shops in Sentin, we are told that 1 kilogram of ginger went beyond 200 rands within a very short space of time, predating and simply fleecing on a vulnerable public at that particular period. So it is very important that you become hawkish, you become more vigilant at this stage more than ever before, because should the situation escalate, should people take advantage and think they are going to make more money at the time when the country and the world is most vulnerable, the situation such as the food insecurity would simply worsen. But the phase we've entered is also a VUCA moment, which social scientists have have explained as volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, within which leaders have to operate, within which institutions have to operate. The current unpredictability and volatility that we see is not a passing phase. It's what leaders will have to deal with. It's no longer going to be possible that you say, I have this one skill, I have this one approach, which I've used for the past 10 years, it's going to work, because the world under our feet is shifting all the time. Take one example, the Internet of Things. The world has now been forced, whether it's your financial systems, the banking system, the transactions, government services, e-education, e-commerce, e-banking, and so forth. What are the implications of these in the balance of power, in the access to services, in the very issues of competition, dominance, and monopolies? Because this has suddenly now shifted things quite dramatically within a very short space of time. Those who have resources may actually use this space to increase their scope of dominance. And that is where the Competition Commission, the competition tribunals, and so forth ought to be reviewing their own skills to say, how are we going to deal with the new manifestation, with the new mutation of the very same issue of anti-competitive behavior, which may now be in more complex spaces. Look at Steinhoff. The state has not been able to prosecute complex cases such as Steinhoff at the rate at which we should be seeing it. Perhaps it might just be a question of saying the financial intelligence, the issue of analyzing creative accounting may not be there in our judiciary to the extent that you do have confidence, or even in our crime intelligence for that matter. So those are some of the new spaces and the new skills that as we build the state capacity, we should be asking, so that we don't solve the problem of yesterday and ignore the problems of tomorrow. So the surge of cybercrime, the mass digital communication, the saturation of facts, the post-truth factor, those are some of the things which are compounding the very space within which we should be building the state capacity. Let me just quickly say, as we look at what we're looking at, we should be mindful of some of the changes which are taking place and ask ourselves, how are they going to impact the work that the Competition Commission is working on? How are these going to impact on the economic recovery and reconstruction? You have local government elections. In your landscape, this ought to have an impact. Of course, this impact may not be immediately felt, but the bylaws and several other things do advantage or disadvantage certain entities, and therefore create spaces for possible monopolies, for possible anti-competitive behavior. The electoral reforms, which the Constitutional Court said should take place before 2024, the party funding disclosures, how are these going to impact the political corporate sector interface? And the release of the Zondo Commission report and the newly energized SIU now investigating cases, and the NPA, which is going to be taking on a number of cases. How are all these going to impact on the whole landscape of building state capacity, of resetting the party? Of course, the ruling party having its own elective conference next year, this always has an impact. Of course, we must be mindful, even if we are not dealing with those spaces, because they do matter, they do impact on what we're doing. Then, of course, the economic recovery efforts at this current moment, which ones will assist the creation of an inclusive economic environment, the reduction of inequality, employment, which ones will actually be taken advantage of because of this lacuna at this stage. So that in itself, the transformation agenda, the land reforms and so forth, in that whole ecosystem, including your investors and the rating agencies, their impact on some of the perceptions, we should be taking those into the whole landscape of what might be and what will be. On the issue of the building institutional capacity of the state, I just want to mention that Chapter 10 of our Constitution was well aware of the importance of public service and public administration, and it sets out rules. It set out institutions that even created the Public Service Commission and several other indicators on how the state itself should be configured so that it can meet the mandate of the Constitution itself. And later on, when the National Development Plan was passed, there is a dedicated chapter which says everything being promised cannot be achieved if you do not have a developmental, capable, ethical state. But most of the time, even as these were out there and we knew they were mentioned, they were not being prioritized because a patrimonial system was the dominant theme at the time when we're talking about these. Hence, then corruption, collapse of institutions, and sometimes collusion between the leaders and the corporate sector on certain things to be squashed, and the lack of appetite to drive this inclusive economy. But it is clear that all other developmental states around the world, there is a close correlation between this state capacity and, of course, leadership and a developmental state. You cannot even begin to utter the word developmental state or even aspire to be one if you do not have a capable, meritocratic, and capacitated state where rules and policies and planning are in place. It is for that reason that whatever Competitions Commission is doing, it might just be a drop in an ocean if it is not operating within the context of a functioning, capable state. Because whatever they are doing would be undercut by what is happening around. So the current efforts, which is quite promising, for the first time, the president in his State of the Nation address, as well as the government, have put the issue of building state capacity as a #1 priority, because it used to be something out there. And many people used to think it was not strategic. You go to parliament and see the committees, they do not think it's strategic. So people who are not senior enough are sent to those committees of public service and administration. And yet, you wouldn't be having collapsing SOEs if you had a capable state. But many people think it is camping in the committees that deals with the ESCOMs of this world, with SAAs and so forth. You talk billions. But the bleeding of billions is precisely because the state had been weakened. That is why this strategic shift to put the building state capacity at the center is one of the most important interventions that we've seen. And if we stick to it, it's going to yield results. Right now, Public Service Commission, the National School of Governments, and the DPSA are leading the process of, finalizing the professionalization of public service, document or framework document. If implemented, taking the ecosystem of the whole system from the training institutions to professional institutions, how we recruit people and so forth, it can turn the situation around. As the Commissioner Bonagela was saying, politics and in our country may take longer to heal given the current crisis. But professionalizing of public service, there is a way of making it faster. And remember that even in countries like Italy, Belgium, Israel, and several others, which have a professional public service, even when coalition governments collapse 4 times in 2 years, the business of the state goes forward because you have institutional memory, you have capable professional public service, which operate irrespective of who is in government or who is not in government. So that in itself, I think, is a very, very important consideration that we should be having at the back of our mind. But even as we deal with those reforms, we should be asking a question: the deep structural inequalities in the country, to what extent even Competition Commission can succeed if those structural inequalities are not dealt with? How do you deal with a society or a country where each sector, each industry is dominated by just a few players? And that in itself, I think, is a matter that we should keep in mind. Very quickly, the key drivers in the study that we did with the Indlulamity Scenarios 2030, having interviewed so many experts and so many ordinary people, it became clear that inequality is the major problem. Leadership and institutional capacity is the next one. And these have generated the third driver, which is resentment and resistance and yearning for reconciliation. And of course, I won't go through the 3 scenarios that we've had. But what is quite clear, though, is that in the early 1990s, South Africa succeeded in the homegrown negotiated settlement. And it was quite successful through those negotiations and CODESA in building the architecture and the institutions of democracy. And in the initial years, this establishment of social security system, your social grants, your electrification, your housing, and so forth. But it is quite clear that we have now taken a knock and are on the decline because we never placed at the center the socio-economic transformation issues very seriously in order to end inequality, in order to address poverty, unemployment, particularly of the youth, in order to address all those spatial dynamics and the apartheid geography. And it is for that reason that one would say this crisis, as it stands, provides the best opportunity for society to revisit those gaps and areas which our transition to democracy seemed not to have taken care of, or where we've taken a detour, to retrace our steps to say, where were we? Those can be done without addressing the issue of institutional capacity of the state in particular. Those can be done without nurturing and building strong leadership in different sectors, in the public sector, in the private sector, in the civil society, in the civic movements. And those cannot be done without having the right policies aligned, but not policies for the sake of policies, because we do have serious problem in the country where we sometimes mistake talking about problems with solving problems. We have very good policy intentions, we have very good governance systems, but very poor in implementation. And that is the gap that we ought to be looking at, to say, how do we address that particular, space? I won't go through major developments, except to say the new epoch and the new geopolitical dynamics globally are beginning to impact on the country itself. The shift into the Internet of Things, our global system now is undergoing some reforms. We are not yet certain as to which direction, which means Competitions Commission and those bodies which are looking at anti-competitive behaviors will have to be one step ahead, because people of goodwill tend to be vague in their envisioning and response to the changes. But the syndicates of ill will tend to be a lot more organized in everything they do. So to me, I want to say, as I conclude, nurturing and building leadership capacity at all levels becomes key. And in so doing, building the state capacity also becomes key. When I talk of building state capacity, I'm drilling up to the micro level of what skills do we need to analyze the anti-competitive behavior. In the era of Bitcoins, in the era of cybercrime, in the era of, transactions that transcend borders, what skills do we need to be ahead of the game? Because those who are anti-competitive in nature are always innovating as well. And of course, uprooting inequality, reconfiguring the policies of the state is key. What capacities do we have in terms of foresight, of forecasting the future, of developing scenarios of the future before they even happen, of anticipating what the mega trends are going to translate into? Because when you start trying to respond to things that have already happened, it is always very difficult. So what new skills, big data analysis, for example, data analytics, and many others that the entities such as the Competitions Commission and of course the state itself should be equipping itself with. I want to close with Madiba's stanza from The Long Walk to Freedom, when he says, I've walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter. I've made missteps along the way, but I've discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I've taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I've come, but I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes a responsibility, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended. It is that collective reflection that we should know that whatever hills we've been climbing, there'll always be the valleys that we have to decline into. But each time, our resolve to say, even out of a crisis, collectively and partnering and envisioning a new future, particularly building state capacity, which is the most urgent project at this moment. Public Service Commission and several other role players are out there ready to stretch their arm of partnership, even with the Competition Commission, and with greater partnership for those who have a common cause. I'm sure we will begin to put the building blocks of a capable state. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Figeni. That was really, truly inspiring words, really reminding us of the importance of collaboration, the importance of being able to not look at everything in all doom and gloom, but understand that even in a crisis such as this, nothing needs to go to waste, but it provides us with an opportunity to be able to really take hold and take stock of where we are and where we could be, and to really address challenges that we have been facing, that we have been trying to address, that this is the moment to do that. Thank you so much, Dr. Figeni, for your wise words. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Figeni has taken us to the point of tea. We will take a 15-minute adjournment. So at 11:15, we will please come back to begin our first plenary session. So please, if everybody can just take a short 15-minute leg stretch to just digest Dr. Figeni's words, and then to come back promptly at 11:15 so that we can begin our first plenary session of the conference. Thank you very much.
Yes, Yasemin.
Francis, how are you?
I'm good, and you? Nice to see you. How's Pretoria?
It's very nice to see you.
Yeah.
Are you well?
I'm well. I'm well. It has been a journey over the period.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it has been. Congratulations on Kenya being part of the steering committee.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, Dean.
Hi, Yasmin. Hi, Francis. I see we are still live on YouTube. So
We are still on the big conference. Hi, Yasmin, and you guys are still on the big conference. This happened to me as well. They said that I was not live yet.
so I think
because I'm not in this panel, but somehow I hear all of you.
You came to our
because
bedroom.
You haven't left.
No, I'm not supposed to leave. You're supposed to be in a different room.